This hourly segment is brought to you by the Money Hour Radio Show, Saturday afternoons at 3 on AM 560, The Answer. Brought to you by Pearshell Financial Group.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, and I've been a longtime reader of our next guest. Don't always agree with them, but it's always thought-provoking, well-written content. And Ross Douthat is going to be in Chicago October 10th to the 12th. He's going to be one of the participants and presenters at the Touchstone Magazine conference, along with other great intellects like Anthony Esolen, Rod Dreyer, many others. Fight or Flight, The Benedict, and Other Options for Facing the World, the Flesh, and the Devil. This is at Trinity University in Deerfield. You can go to touchdownmag.com to register. Again, October 10th to the 12th. Ross has written some provocative columns of late in the context of the impeachment melodrama playing out before us. And we're pleased to be welcomed by Ross Douthat, author and New York Times columnist. Ross, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
So one of your more recent pieces, you talk of the last exit from Trump land. And so I guess the question for some, are we passing that last exit from Trump land? And a corollary would be, should we be doing so happily? You seem to suggest we need to get beyond President Trump as quickly as humanly possible.
Well, I think what I was saying in the column was that if you talk to Republicans in Washington, sort of, not on the record, but off the record, all of them find the idea of another 4 years of the Trump presidency kind of unimaginable. There's no real policy agenda to speak of. Trump himself has sort of cleaned house and reduced his White House to his family members and a few aides who are all holding about 6 jobs at once. Mick Mulvaney, his chief of staff, is also doing like 3 other jobs. And so there's sort of an assumption, I think, among a lot of Republicans that the president's going to lose re-election and that that's actually going to be good for the Republican Party because they can start having debates about what the Republican Party should stand for after Trump, which is hard to do as long as he's in office doing nothing and engaging in Twitter wars. The problem is, of course, that Trump could win re-election, right? And,
yes.
And I think there'll be a lot of Republicans who will have officially supported him who will wake up on Election Day if he wins, if he pulls out another close one, and say, well, what do we do now? And they have no idea. And that was, so the argument was basically impeachment is sort of their last out.
It's the so you believe Jeff Flake when he says 30-plus GOP senators would vote to impeach Trump? You believe that?
If they could do so privately.
If it was a secret ballot, right? That was Flake's line.
Right.
But
as long as their voters didn't have to know, I'd say I'd guess half. Yeah, I'd guess half the Senate would. I mean, half the Republican Senate.
Yeah, well, I mean, and Jeff Flake has graduated from the Senate to the salvation business, I read in the Washington Post, which is really quite something. But with respect to the Republicans, there was this back and forth earlier in this week on Twitter where all productive discussions happen, as you know. And
I know well.
Yeah, but it was essentially just some like regular Trump supporter pushing back against some of the pundits who are suffering from Trump battle fatigue because the socialists are unimaginable. And he said, hey, look, man up, basically. Even if you don't like his personality, his approach, even if there are aspects of his policy agenda you don't like, I'd suggest there are probably aspects of the policy agendas of previous Republican presidents you didn't like either, which is how we've gotten to this place of $23 trillion in debt, another $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities, and all the other failures of big government gambits that Republicans have participated in. So you know what? Man up a little bit, because turning the keys over to Elizabeth Warren or even Joe Biden, that is what Republicans should see as unimaginable.
Well, and the reality is that all those Republican senators who would vote to remove him if it were a secret ballot are going to officially agree with that person, right? I mean, there's not going to be some big turn against Trump in the Republican primary or in the general election. I think the idea of the impeachment as an exit is that if you impeach Trump, or if you remove him from office, Elizabeth Warren doesn't become president. Joe Biden doesn't become president. Boring old vanilla Republican Mike Pence becomes president. And if it happened really quickly, you would actually then have an interesting Republican primary with a lot of people maybe running against Pence. So weirdly, the case for the Republican who doesn't want Elizabeth Warren weirdly actually has an opportunity in the impeachment debate to get to get Mike Pence as president, basically, which is not what they actually want. I think most Republicans have convinced themselves, many Republican voters have convinced themselves that because Trump beat Hillary, only Trump can beat Warren or Biden and so on. And I'm skeptical of that, but I think that's where the voters are.
Well,
where the senators are is a different matter.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of that too, but I have this qualifier. Anybody who would run in that environment, if it wasn't Mike Pence would be the only one who could essentially argue to the Trump voter that I'm here to seek vengeance on behalf of Trump being deposed, because you would have I would assume a significant percentage of Trump voters, many of whom were first time in a long time voters, not be on board with anybody who wasn't part of the Trump regime and as an advocate. And number two, even in the case of Marco Rubio or somebody else, the left is still going to paint all Republicans with a Trump stink in the context of him being removed from office. So I don't, and they'll paint Mike Pence as a theocrat. So I don't know how it's just so simple that you remove Trump and then somebody else just steps up and beats Elizabeth Warren or whoever.
It's not simple at all. It's a triple bank shot.
Okay.
The only argument for it is that if Trump, when you look at what's happening in the Trump White House now, what's happened since the Democrats took the House, sort of the condition of the Trump administration, and you say, we're going to put this guy in office for 4 more years. We've sort of skated through without a big foreign policy crisis or a recession. If you get either of those in a Trump second term, I don't think his White House is equipped. I don't think they're equipped to handle anything right now. And I think that's for a lot of Republicans in Washington, the fear that you reelect him, you beat Elizabeth Warren, you congratulate yourselves, and then you get something like the last 2 years of George W. Bush's presidency where basically bad things happen and the Republican Party is totally wiped out. Pundits are always wrong about the future. So,
well, do you feel as if President Trump hijacked the Republican Party? That he saw, look, I'm not going to be able to beat him, because he was at one point in time, well, he has donated to Democratic candidates.
He didn't steal it. I mean, he stood for election.
I think Trump saw a real gap between where Republican voters were and where Republican politicians were.
Yeah. And
I think his campaign did a really good job of exploiting that and saying, this party stands for endless wars and tax cuts for the rich. I'm going to be the party of, come home America and rebuild infrastructure and, middle-class tax cuts. I think his campaign was really successful at that, and in a way he deserved to win. I think as president, he hasn't really known how to translate that into effective policymaking, and he, like a pundit, he'd rather be arguing on Twitter than dealing with Capitol Hill.
Well,
and I sympathize with that, but it's hard to imagine how it runs for another 5 years, I guess.
I want to get to beyond Trump and actually go before Trump. This piece that you wrote in the New York Times, "The Corruption Before Trump," is really, really interesting. And I like the comparison, too, to sort of the old Roman Republic and how personal enrichment worked at that time with statesmen versus how the personal enrichment paradigm that we've installed in this country, and that in part, as you were just talking about, gave rise to President Trump. Lay that out for us.
Sure. I mean, basically, we have a system where we're an incredibly rich society, and if you're a politician in Washington, D.C., you're surrounded by people who are much, much richer than you, and you're sort of in competition with them for where you're going to send your kids to school and what kind of home you're going to buy and so on. And so we've evolved this system where politicians are able to get rich after they're in office, not by taking bribes or doing things that are sort of overtly illegal or corrupt, but by sitting on 6 corporate boards and doing lobbying work for our allies and all of the kind of things of which Hunter Biden working for a Ukrainian gas company is sort of the most extreme example. And I think a big part of what gave us Trump was this sense that you had all these politicians of both parties who were doing this, who were sort of moving back and forth in and out of government, working not just for American companies, but for foreign companies. And their projects kept making them money, but not delivering for America, right? You know, we had huge intervention in the Middle East. We sent all our best and brightest to Russia after the end of after the Soviet Union fell, and they were supposed to turn Russia into a capitalist democracy. We've had all of this interaction with China where, you know, it was supposed to make China free, right? We were going to open Chinese markets and everyone was going to get rich and China was going to become a democracy. And instead, the Middle East is a mess. Russia is run by Putin and China is becoming more authoritarian. And we lost a ton of manufacturing jobs to them. And yet people in Washington kept getting rich.
Well,
and so there's sort of a failure of this bargain, basically. I think the American people don't mind if their politicians get rich after they're in office, as long as the projects those politicians are working on seem to be succeeding for the country as a whole. And that, I think, hasn't been happening over the last 20 years.
Yeah, you write in your piece about this. Trump was offering a unified rejection of the entire way that American public servants of both parties have claimed to harmonize small r Republican service and self-enrichment, the entire ideological edifice justifying cashing in. And I know that there are concerns about Trump as the messenger and the deliverer on that topic. But I mean, do you think that perhaps the message resonated? The message, and I'm not talking about in the 2016 election. I'm saying, do you think the message resonated within the circles of Republican Party politics? So they will take the lesson, and in the future, beyond Trump, whether it's one more term or not, they will adopt that as part of the Republican value proposition, or if not, they should.
They should. I'm not sure they will. I mean, I think Trump, like if you look right now, right? I mean, the way Trump has governed is basically he has been in certain ways more flagrant in terms of, you know, having foreign potentates come stay at his hotel and so on. And the way that he justifies this is by saying everything is corrupt, the others are more corrupt than I am, and so on. And that's his message, right? His message is not I'm the most honorable and honest of men. DC is so corrupt that you need a tough guy like me to deal with it. I think that message will continue, but I think if you wanted to really fix the system, you would have to go beyond that. You would have to say, like, you would have to have a Republican leadership that was, you know, frankly, a little bit less self-interested than Trump, and that sort of could be seen as draining, not just defeating their enemies. Like that's what Trump is. Trump is basically voters saying the system is corrupt. We just want someone to defeat our enemies, and that's fine for sort of day-to-day battles. But if you want to really change the system, you have to go beyond that a little bit.
But isn't it more than just day-to-day battles? Because I would suggest that his unwillingness to defer to most of the assembled constituencies of the cultural Marxist left, that's a real value add. That's not only does it stop bad things potentially or retard the speed at which they're being implemented. It sets the table for the fight for other people to engage. So, I mean, if you're concerned about so all of the pernicious manifestations of identity politics, then you've basically had for example, protecting things that we should hold inviolate, like religious liberty or the sanctity of human life, then you've had a friend in President Trump.
Sure. The question is, and I'm just pushing on you a little bit, right?
Yeah,
the
sure.
question is, this is, we're a democratic society where you win victories ultimately by persuading lots of people who weren't on your side to be on your side. And that's what, if you look at Ronald Reagan's big victories, that's what he did. Reaganism was a 55% of the country proposition for the Republican Party. Right now, Trumpism is a 40 to 45% of the country proposition. Mm-hmm. And so he's basically the guy. He's doing something defensive, right, for conservatives. He's saying, I'm going to fight every battle. I'm not going to concede an inch, and I'm going to create space maybe for other people to fight battles as well. And that can be valuable, but you still have to figure out a way to get from right now 40% of the country supports Trump. That's poll after poll, and then you can get up to 45% if he stays off Twitter for a couple weeks. You need to figure out how you get from there to 55%, or else this is just a sort of temporary. It's a temporary, bulwark thrown up against forces that are going to overwhelm you eventually.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point and a good analysis. But I would say I think there's an underappreciation for creating the space for other people to fill in and battle rather than just being passively throwing up their hands because they see Republicans for at least a couple generations that were sort of, to borrow a Roger Kimballism, the housebroken mascots of the party, but they weren't fighters and they weren't galvanizing other people to fight some of these cultural and economic battles. And Trump has done that. So, yeah, what's the transition and how quickly do you get to it? All fair points, but that making the ground fertile for people to battle on principle, that's a big thing.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a world where you look back and say the Trump era was this really important turning point for the Republican Party and figuring out what it actually stands for in a post-Cold War world, right? A sort of, getting beyond the Reagan agenda, which was an agenda for the 1970s and 1980s. But the question again is, how do you get there without letting Trump's faults do a lot of damage along the way?
But a lot of people like the way he works. I mean, yesterday he talked about